and welcome to the GSC Grays Podcast. Today we'll be talking about our farm business advice service. Our team have been providing business consultancy to farmers across the north of England, supporting them through the agricultural transition, helped by DEFRA's Future Farm Resilience Fund. We've helped nearly 1,000 farmers already with their businesses, and there have been some really interesting themes and consistent opportunities that farmers can take advantage of. Today, I am joined by Greg Ricketts, who's the director and head of our farm business department. Greg has over 30 years' experience as a farm business consultant, and he is key to the running of the Farm Business Advice Service project. So welcome, Greg. Okay, so today we're talking about the Farm Business Advice Service. Now, a lot of people will have heard about it. Some may have indeed had one of the reviews, but just for those who haven't, could you give a really succinct overview of what the Farm Business Advice Service is?
Yeah, so the Farm Business Advice Service is a sort of range of consultancy services, and we've got two key elements that start the process off. There's a half-day review, which can either have a focus on the business and business issues, or a second alternative, which is an SFI focus, and really to look at those two elements in isolation. And it's an overview, and then following on from that, we have a range of follow-on services that can be utilised to look at more specialist areas, whether that's further work on environmental schemes, more in-depth business planning, looking at the farming techniques and the farming system, agronomy, arable regeneration, grassland regeneration systems, those kind of things. So it's a range of services.
Very bespoke to fit what farmers need.
It was one of the things that we actually felt at the outset was really important, is not to have this is a service and this is what we can offer. It was trying to cater for all of the needs that we thought we saw at the time we put our proposals to DEFRA, and that range of services we think has been really important in making sure our service is as good as it can be. Even now, we possibly come across one or two things where perhaps it doesn't quite fit the criteria that we've set out, but we're trying to encompass that and expand the range of the offering for farmers to get the best effect for their benefit.
Okay, so I said in the introduction, we've seen nearly 1,000 farmers so far. How are farmers finding the agricultural transition?
I think on the whole, farmers are finding the agricultural transition, there's a lot of change going on. There's some big challenges there, but generally I think people are embracing that need for change. They're looking positively about what they can do differently with the farm business and actually taking it forward in a constructive way, rather than agonising too much about what might have been, what could be going, in terms of, there's still a bit of criticism, I think, of DEFRA with regard to rolling out schemes such as the SFI, which is now in a lot better position than it was, and there's much more information, and it's a really positive scheme that's available. Perhaps 6 months ago, there was quite a bit of criticism of those things. So I think farmers are moving, they're on a journey, and that process is beginning, and I think it's gathering momentum and actually a more positive outlook from most farmers with regard to change for the future.
So, Greg, what some people might not already be aware of is that with the Farm Business Review, we've got the SFI review and we have the business-focused review. Now, with the business-focused review, could you just walk us through the different components of that and why we have constructed the FBAS review to be the way it is?
Certainly. In terms of the half-day business review, what we're really trying to do is understand the business from the farmer's perspective at the outset. So we're looking at things like the objectives of the family, first and foremost, because that sets the direction of everything that we do. And then there's some basic details which won't be telling farmers any more than they know already about the farm business, but sets the context. And then within the report, we're trying to draw in things like a bit of review of financial performance and accounts performance, a SWOT analysis, so looking at the strengths, the weaknesses and the opportunities, threats for the business. And out of that, trying to develop a bit of a plan to look forward to exploit the opportunities, minimise the weaknesses and the threats, and really develop a bit of an action plan that we can then work on with clients for the future to develop more, to look at more specialist areas if that's what's required. So it's very much an overview of the business. It's certainly not the end result, and very much what follows on from that is absolutely fundamental.
Because a lot of farmers, well, in fact, a lot of people in general, day to day, you've just got your head down and you're doing the doing. And it's just that opportunity, isn't it, to just have a breath, look forward into the future, actually, where are you going? And then the advice is tailored, isn't it? So that it's in the best way possible to help them achieve that.
Definitely. I think one of our roles is we're hopefully objective. We're a third party. We're an outsider looking in, and we can perhaps help people stand back, take that longer term view and think about the future direction with, taking the space just to do that. And then, really to try and develop the farming policy for the longer term.
And so the SFI review, which a lot of people have been taking advantage of simply because we've got a lot more information now about SFI, don't we? And it's looking like more of a promising proposition. So how does that differ then from the sort of the business-focused review?
So the SFI review is very much looking at the options and opportunities to implement an SFI agreement on farm, and really going right through from the basic details, which options are most appropriate to the farm, what might that deliver in terms of financial returns, how does it fit with the farming system, what changes need to be made to the enterprises and everything else, and really to come up with a little bit of a plan to complete an application, which is the next stage, and get that scheme up and running. I think what also comes out, although that's a very focused review on the sustainable farming incentive options and opportunities, what we are finding is that also helps open up a discussion with farmers about the wider direction of the business, where they're going, how it fits with the family and everything else. So it sort of leads into business areas that need to be considered, but it isn't necessarily the starting point. And there's a very key focus in that first piece of work.
Because that's very, again, sort of future focused, because the options that they might choose very much depend on what their ambitions are moving forward.
Definitely.
Okay. So, as I said in the introduction, we've seen nearly 1,000 farmers so far. And I guess a key kind of question for me, we read a lot in the farming press, but just in the north of England, how are farmers finding the transition?
Yep, that's a good question. Pretty key question, I think. And the honest answer is there's a range of views in terms of how people are finding it. And some are finding it more difficult at one end of the spectrum, and some are finding that perhaps the transition's sort of almost a catalyst for change and really embracing that positively. So it's a huge amount of change. And I think in terms of looking forward, farmers are they recognise that the basic payment is going, perhaps combined with low profitability. Most of the clients I work with, they're really rolling their sleeves up and getting stuck into saying, okay, we do need to change our business going forward, and we've got to come up with some solutions. We might not be wildly excited about the loss of the basic payment. We would have preferred that system to continue, but they're accepting that it's changing and then starting to look at the options and solutions for their individual business going forward. So I think on the whole, quite positive approach, but there are inevitably one or two that are perhaps feeling a little bit more aggrieved about the change in system and and are not particularly happy about it. And we have to recognise that as well.
Okay, and so for those who are finding the transition a little bit trickier, what are the biggest challenges that we're sort of helping farmers to overcome through the transition?
That's a good question as well. In terms of, I think probably for the more challenged situations, sometimes there's a combination of things. I think there could be perhaps part of it might be the attitude of mind in terms of the farmer themselves. And
right, so a bit of a mindset
very
shift.
Entrenched in their views. And that's, farmers are strong characters, and that's inevitably how they can see things. But equally, there are situations where perhaps, to give you an illustration, I recently got involved in a business where they farm about 300 acres or so, only own 100 acres. So for them, the options of implementing an SFI agreement on farm are relatively small because they can only do it on the land they own. The rest of the 200 acres is farmed on a sort of joint venture type approach, but the owner of the land has claimed the previous basic payment and they will qualify for SFI. So that in that situation, they're perhaps finding it more difficult to find solutions from environmental schemes to encompass with the farming policy. And perhaps, the enterprises were beef and sheep, so they're more challenged generally, and the profitability is often a little bit low. So those kind of, that's a more difficult situation to solve than perhaps where somebody's farming 500 or 600 acres, they've got bigger, which they own and control or rent on a tenancy that allows them to make use of all of the support schemes that are there, but also they've got the scale of the business. So again, individual circumstances can be very, very different and can make the situation easier or more difficult to address.
Okay, because I thought you were going to say just the loss of the BPS is the biggest challenge. Is that not necessarily the case?
It is the biggest challenge, but I think behind that is also a lack of profitability in farming businesses. And in some respects, and I could be criticised for this, I think, but I would suggest that some of the problems that are there now with the removal of the BPS are down to the lack of the profitability of the enterprises that have been on farm, and that has been supported by the basic payment. But what it's also done is allow a continuation of low performance businesses to continue. And I don't think that's been particularly helpful for some farms. It's not true in all situations. There's some really profitable farm businesses out there with, they've got a good enterprise mix. They've done things differently. They're very low cost of production if they're an out and out food producer, or perhaps diversified and got other enterprises going, looking at all the resources really well. So I think many would say, yes, the loss of the basic payment is the most important issue. I think there are some other issues underlying that have almost held the profitability down. Taking away the basic payment has just exacerbated or really brought it to the front of people's minds. And there's perhaps, it is a key driver for change, but there are other issues in there as well.
Okay. So when we've been out to see all of these farmers, what have been the sort of the solutions, the easy fixes, or the things that we're kind of seeing across the board where it's a case of if farmers took this action, and this action, they'd immediately be in a better place moving forward, regardless it will, of course, vary farm type, location, etc. But just is there anything sort of straightforward that you can identify?
I think in many respects, if we start with SFI, there are some easy wins in there. If you take the herbal lays, for a lot of grass-based systems, that actually fits really, really well. It provides some income for the actions that are being taken, but it also is helping reduce reliance on inputs and therefore improving the profitability, potentially leads to a bit of a change in stocking levels and perhaps total output might be coming down, but the business might be more profitable as a result. And there's a range of those, SFI actions that also can help contribute. Okay. But I think it's more, that's only part of it. I mean, that's very relevant at the moment because of the changes that DEFRA introduced in the autumn with regard to those schemes. But if you actually look at other areas where easy wins probably within the business, particularly where the profitability has been lower, are probably a little bit harder to find. There is no one size fits all. Okay. And things that people can do. They're looking at, should we be reducing our borrowing? Does that mean some asset sales at one end of the spectrum, whether that's machinery and equipment, livestock, or even land sales? And does that help restructure the business? Do they look at the farming system and actually really, cost of production is key on lots of farming businesses, and it's probably been too high in some sectors for the current output prices. Okay. And so challenging that and looking at learning from others as to how they get the cost of production down, that can be it's not a quick fix. It takes. Is
that when you talk about that, is that sort of like your micro efficiencies and really sort of shining a spotlight on where small improvements could be made across the board, and then that helps with the profitability?
Definitely, because it's not often we go to a farm business and you do a drains up review, as some people refer to it, and you pull up the manhole covers and underneath is, 2 or 3 solutions that just delivers a nice 10, 15, 20 grand uplift in profit. It doesn't happen like that. If it did, we wouldn't be there, I don't think.
Yeah.
It's usually, can we save £1,000 or £2 here, and can we do something else over here? And the combination of those is more powerful, and you get to the result. But if you look at how farmers work in discussion groups, and particularly, where they compare their financial performance, they're challenging each other because they're trying to find those marginal gains, and those marginal gains are much harder to find than the easy wins, as you referred to it.
Okay. So farmers, we're encouraging farmers to take a look at SFI. That's one of the and then have a look at the sort of efficiencies and things that they can make across the business. What about in terms of any kind of diversification opportunities, or, sort of looking at maybe planning opportunities or share farming or anything like that? Is there anything that we're kind of seeing along those lines?
I think absolutely we're seeing all of those things. And again...
Because we're sticking with easy wins, though, because we're going to go into more detail on all of that.
Definitely. I mean, things like solar and renewables, that actually could be an easy win in some situations, particularly actually, again, there's some grants again now, so that's helpful in that respect. But probably energy efficiency, energy use, particularly with the cost of fuel as it was previously, massive issue going forward. And actually not just the economics of it, but the requirements to achieve net zero and everything else. So there's, that again is a combination of things. It's one, my customers and my marketplace is demanding that approach, but we also need to do it from the financial perspective to get the costs down as well. And diversification is often... We were obviously at Farmers Weekly question time a few weeks ago. Interesting debate about, why should I convert my farm buildings to a holiday let or a farm shop or a cafe or some other enterprise, whatever that might be, to support the farming business? Well, actually, people shouldn't do that, in my opinion. Both enterprises should be viable in their own right. The farming business, if it's not working financially, needs some review. But on the other side, if you've got resources, why aren't you using them to best effect to get the most return, whether that's for farming opportunities or for alternative diversified opportunities? So we would suggest that really thorough review.
Digging a little bit deeper, so we've sort of, in the introduction, we talked about the half-day review, and then we've got the follow-on support, and we have mentioned things like restructuring, diversification, budgeting, that sort of thing. Do you have any good examples? And, I'm sort of happy to work through each of them, or if maybe you can pick three off the top of your head of where we've been brought in through the Farm Business Advice Service, we've done the half-day review, and then we've done some kind of in-depth follow-on work that's really made an impact to the profitability and sustainability of the business moving forward.
Jake Nixon, one of our colleagues, so he got involved in a business in the sort of... in the Pennines, where they were looking at basically sheep farming on very extensive grass, but ran a number of different flocks of sheep. And the sort of half-day review gave rise to actually some questioning of, are all of those flocks making money, or are we actually losing some money on some of them because of the way we look after them, what we have to do to manage that flock, the individual circumstances? And out of the review, so they reduced down the number of breeds that they've got on that farm. And it's not proven yet because they've only just done some figures to analyse the financial performance, try and get a feel for how each of the flocks is performing, but they're condensing down the number of breeds to get a more efficient and profitable system. So a really practical farming illustration of how things are changing. We've got people who are looking at diversification. Perhaps they're already doing some marketing.
Hang on, sorry, going back to just the example that you just gave. So that's one of the critical things, isn't it? When we're sort of looking at kind of that full budgeting and financial performance, one of the things is it's analysing the different enterprises within the business, because a lot of farming businesses have different components to it, and it's really shining a spotlight on which is profitable and which isn't. And actually, across the board, what we tend to find is that sometimes the business is losing quite a bit of money through part of the farm that they had, and they had absolutely no idea, because it's all sort of meshed together, isn't it? And sometimes it's that breakdown, looking at the individual component parts, and then they can actually make some changes relatively easily. And then, and just as illustrated in your example, and hopefully that makes the business more viable going forward. Yeah.
Indeed. I think we're seeing more and more requests in that respect as well. I think usually most farmers have a pretty good feel for what's going on in the business, and they know where it's working and where it's not working. They might not say that at the outset.
Yeah, it might be their favourite bit of the business, that actually it's the bit that they enjoy. And
quite often the case. I mean, if you take, definitely. But we're getting more and more requests. We've had something recently where it's an arable business, and they want to look at the enterprise performance from different varieties of one crop, because they want to know whether they're actually making money or not making money out of those individual varieties of the crop, as well as looking at the range of, across the wheat, the barley, the potatoes, the other crops that they've got on the farm, as well as the individual crops that they want to break down between the crops, because they've got a feeling that they're actually, some things are working and some things aren't. But you need to do that. It's that granularity of getting behind the numbers. And perhaps that is something where we can help with a bit more detail. We've had quite a lot of experience of doing it, and we feel reasonably competent in our ability to do it, and to do it with detail that is then meaningful and either supports or challenges what people actually believe themselves. So it's, again, part of that teamwork approach, really.
Yeah. And you mentioned, sorry, before I rudely interrupted you, diversification. And diversification doesn't always mean opening a farm shop, does it?
It nearly always means not opening a farm shop, I think. Diversification is a new enterprise. It could be a new farming enterprise as well as an alternative enterprise to farming, if that's the right way of looking at it. And I think you have to, but it's about using those resources that you've got. Is there a building that can be used for storage that isn't really generating much income at the moment? Or is there a building that could be converted to an office let or something along those lines? And often, most of our clients have done some diversification in some way, shape or form already. And it's just a question of a continuation of the trend and the theme, I think, in terms of, a farm is a collection of resources. You've got land, buildings, people, machinery and equipment. It's just how you use those to generate the business return.
So do we have any examples then of diversification projects that we've helped people with through FBAS?
Definitely, we do have lots of examples of diversification. I think we have sometimes it's harder with diversification, I think, to just drop on what is the solution. To give you an example, James Thompson and I were on a farm, relatively isolated farm with a large grain store, really lend itself to some alternative uses, but the location's possibly against it in that situation in terms of, but it could be, and the proximity to farm buildings for things like a holiday let. So we're looking at some planning applications with regard to office lets, which might be more compatible with what they're doing, and then trying to see whether that's a potential opportunity. Although it's remote, it's not that remote from towns and population, but it's just the location doesn't lend itself immediately to some diversification opportunities that we might see on farms. So it's a question of looking at individual circumstances for diversification. What can you do on your farm differently and what can you offer? There's lots of tourism and things is often quite a bit overdone. Coming up with those new, unique ideas is tricky.
It's quite tricky.
Yeah. But I had a meeting yesterday with some clients in Cumbria, and they are looking at, you were talking about joint ventures and contract farming agreements. And these people have got a farm where they're looking at going into a contract agreement with a neighbouring farmer who's already marketing meat and they're marketing their own production directly to the public and have got a good following for that. And the aim there is likely to be to expand that out across both farms, so increasing the production and hopefully longer term selling all of the meat direct. It's quite a long-term project. It's going to need some energy and drive to increase sales. It's a reasonable sized farm that could come under the contract agreement. But it's just an example of how people are looking at things differently and trying to get hold of a bit better price in the marketplace and hold on to that return and the profit that's there for the farming business rather than see it go to others who are processing meat and milk or whatever it might be.
It's going slightly off piste here, but one of the questions that I have is there's a lot of change happening through the transition. Is it your view, so we've not really talked about it, but succession is obviously something that a lot of farmers are thinking about it, particularly when you look at kind of the age demographic of a lot of farmers at the moment. Would you say that one, succession's kind of a big discussion that we're having on farm while we're going out, and two, is the transition accelerating the handover to the next generation?
I think the answer to your questions about succession, absolutely. One, it's a big issue and people are thinking about it a lot more seriously at the moment and probably trying to think 5, 10, 15 years ahead, not just this year, next year, and do we hand over to the next generation. I think also some of that's being driven by the younger generation, just challenging the parents and saying, come on, what are we going to be doing with the business? Do we want to work for 30 years and then take over? Actually, do we want a piece of the action now and actually get involved in it and look at those new enterprises, do the diversification or change the farming system, whatever that might be. So very definitely it's gone up the agenda. And I think it is something that is being talked about and we are getting more involved. Again, it's one of our component parts of the follow-on services is very much succession planning, and it is pretty key to the future direction. The changes are so big at the moment that are going on. If you haven't got a succession plan, you almost would wonder why you're doing it. And some of our colleagues would say, actually, any business planning should be started with a succession plan. What are you going to do when you've finished your working life? And how are you going to hand that over to others, sell the business, do whatever it might be? So starting with that, it's not usually where most people start with business planning. They tend to start at the other end as to what can we do now? But it's a good way of thinking about things for the future. And I think very definitely I was talking to, again, James Thompson upstairs, and he was talking about with SFI reviews, often that might be the main part of our work at the moment, but actually lots of farmers are then starting to talk about where they're going for the future, how they plan the succession. Do they use things like the SFI to draw back a little bit and maximise the use of the opportunities, environmental opportunities, and do a little bit less physical work on the farm? But it's all part of the transition process and it is leading to those discussions as well, very definitely.
When you talk about sort of people taking a step back from farming and sort of taking advantage of environmental opportunities, a question that I have is there seem to be quite a few sort of grey areas for farmers at the moment. Well, you mentioned previously that we've got a lot more detail on SFI now, which is fantastic, but 6 months ago we were having to advise farmers without necessarily having all of that information. There are more and more kind of emerging markets with sort of carbon, biodiversity net gain, environmental opportunities that are coming up. But again, there's some ambiguity over sort of the tax position and how that might play out in years to come. I think that's a key part of the rationale as to why people would get advice when they're looking to make these decisions. But in your view, sort of how are we helping farmers overcome that uncertainty, those grey areas, when they're looking at planning for their business for the future?
Again, another good question. And I think in terms of the market, the environment that a business operates is always changing. And actually, some of what we're doing is no different now. It'll be just the same in 5 years' time. There'll be uncertainty. There always is when you're running a farming business. So perhaps understanding the business performance now and how it compares with others relative to whatever one's doing is quite key. I think also getting the detail around, so if we're looking at a new enterprise, what's it likely to generate in terms of returns? And actually, what's the sensitivity analysis around that in terms of if the price for what we're producing goes up or down, or the input costs change dramatically? What's the impact? And does that make that risk analysis, if that's the right word, does it make it worthwhile pursuing that enterprise, or actually is it too risky that actually we can't afford to do it because the marketplace is always going to be a little bit temperamental and fluctuations in price? So there's those kind of things, and we'll never answer those questions because we're always looking forward, and that's trying to predict the future. On the other side, there's an awful lot of detail that one can do and not necessarily answer all the questions. I'm not a tax specialist or whatever, but there are different within any new enterprise, and particularly you talked about the B&G type options that are available. Some of those, there is quite a bit of uncertainty, but it is a gradually evolving process, and there is clearer advice and guidance, or there's more advice and guidance as to where the risk areas are to do your homework. And then you've got to take a judgment about whether you pursue those options or not. So that, so I think in terms of we can help pick off some of those areas of concern or areas that need looking at in a bit more detail to sort of formulate the plan, but we might not be in the position, we're not necessarily able to help answer all of the questions that need to be addressed in any new venture.
But you can help them be as informed as they possibly can be, and also with the context of knowing where they're looking to go and what they need.
Absolutely.
Then,
And when you make a business decision, you try and do 70% of it's based on fact and where things are, and 30% of it is a judgment call. Do I have confidence in this marketplace to deliver me a return? Take milk, for example. We've seen huge volatility in the price of milk. You've got to be pretty determined in those sectors to make a living from it, and actually committed to it and prepared to take the tough times.
So have hope and faith that the price will go up at some point.
And confidence that your cost of production is as low as it possibly can be, so that actually you're not, I don't say this in the last person standing, but you are more resilient because your cost of production is lower. So it's those kind of things that, in terms of looking forward and with uncertainty, you can't get all of the ducks in a row, but you can get some of them lined up so that you can, you're in a strong position to compete effectively and go forward with a strong, profitable business.
Greg, your predictions for the next 5 years for farming, because we're obviously going through a lot of change, and any final words of advice that you have for farmers who are currently going through the change based on your experience of FBAS and seeing so many farmers across the north?
So my predictions for the future of farming and for farmers, I think on balance, I'm really positive about the future. I think there will be some challenges for some, and we may see a change in the number of active farming businesses going forward. Perhaps those that are more professional in their approach will grow the farming business, and some that are perhaps at an age of approaching retirement will look to draw back and allow others to farm their farms. I think in terms of my personal view is that, particularly with the way I find clients at the moment, and working with those clients, is they're really embracing the need for change. They're embracing the need to improve the profitability. I think longer term the sector is going to be more robust, more resilient. We're going to see better profit levels overall because of the challenges that occur here now and the need for change. So my personal view is I'm really positive about the prospects for the future, and I think we'll have a strong industry going forward, but perhaps with slightly lower number of farming businesses actively farming, if that's the right way of looking at it. Okay.
And any words of advice?
And any words of advice, that's always that's what we're in the business of doing, isn't it? But I think we've got to look positively about change, understand where your business is now, how it compares with others, be pretty critical and, challenge the system. If it's working well, great, but what can we do better? If it's not working so well, actually be prepared to accept that firstly. Perhaps that's the starting point. And then really don't leave any stone unturned. Look at all the options, consider it quite broadly, work on the plan with others, and in terms of, and take those opportunities that are there for your farm rather than think about what other people are doing and how it compares, you know, with them. Because I think, you know, every farming business is different. So look at your own farm and how it needs to change for your own needs longer term.
So that's been really informative. Thank you so much, Greg. Do you have any final thoughts?
I think my final thoughts are perhaps take the opportunity to sit down with the family, have a look at objectives for the future, see where you think you're taking the business, have a cold, hard look at the numbers in terms of financial performance and what might change. And we would encourage people to use the Farm Business Advice Service. It's available until March 2025. Places are limited, so get it while you can.
Thank you so much, Greg. That's fantastic advice, as always. The next podcast, which will be in a fortnight's time, will be with farm business consultant Jake Nixon, where we'll be looking at the question of whether farmers should intensify, extensify, or simplify their farming business to be more profitable and sustainable for the future. I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much.